Hi guys, this is day 30 of the AS Economics 42-day revision challenge, and today we are doing devaluation. So what is devaluation? Well, a country which has a fixed exchange rate or sometimes managed float can resort to devaluation, which is basically lowering our exchange rate. So devaluation is simply when we lower our exchange rate. Why do we do that? Well, we know this: when the exchange rate goes down, exports can become cheaper and imports can become expensive. So PX means price of exports. So price of exports will fall and price of imports will go up. And the goal is hopefully that can make our X minus M to go up. So in order to improve our current account deficit in the balance of payments, sometimes the government decides to reduce exchange rate, which can make the exports to be cheaper, imports to be expensive, and therefore X minus M goes up. And that's what we wrote here. If you read this, that exports will become less expensive and imports will become more expensive, and depending on how responsive domestic consumers and foreign consumers are to these price changes, there should be an improvement in the current account as export revenue rises. Export revenue basically means X, and import revenue falls means M going down, and therefore X minus M going up. But there's an important line that we want to read here, because we said here that depending on how responsive domestic consumers and foreign consumers are to these price changes. This is an important thing to understand, this, that if producers and consumers domestically and foreign do not respond to these price changes, which means they're not as demand is not as what we call elastic, then we might have a problem, because there could be a possibility that devaluation may not work. So I want to talk about the conditions which are necessary for devaluation to work now, and that will also explain what do we mean by responsiveness of domestic consumers. So basically, devaluation will work when, number one, or A, there is no retaliation from other countries in terms of counter devaluation or trade barriers. What do we mean by this? Well, basically, counter devaluation is when, if let's say Pakistan decides to devalue its currency in order to make its goods more cheaper than, let's say, Sri Lanka, and let's say Sri Lanka does the same with Pakistan, they also devalue the currency, and ultimately both countries end up devaluing the currency by an equal percentage, then that means basically export prices as compared to Sri Lanka domestic prices may not change, and therefore devaluation may not work. Or let's say Pakistan decides to devalue its currency, and let's say Sri Lanka decides to put a trade barrier like a quota or a tariff. If that happens, that's a problem. Why? Because then we make our good cheaper by making our exchange rate fall, but at the same time another country just put a tariff on us and make our price go back to the same level. So there should not be any counter devaluation or trade barrier which results in basically the prices to not change ultimately. The second condition is an important one. It says is that if devaluation has to be successful, we have to make sure that the Marshall-Lerner condition must be true. What is Marshall-Lerner condition? Well, Marshall-Lerner condition says this, that the PED of X plus PED of M should be greater than 1, which means that the sum of the elasticities of demand for exports and imports will be greater than 1. So what do we mean by this? Well, what if I tell you PED of X is, like, for example, 0.4, and PED of M is, for example, let's say 8. Now, separately you can see these, both of them are inelastic. And I want to just look at, if a good is inelastic, what happens. So let's say if a good is inelastic and we lower exchange rate. So if you lower exchange rate, and let's say my PED of X is, for example, is for example 0.4, what will happen then? Well, if my PED of X is 0.4 and I lower my exchange rate, then basically what I'm trying to do is this, that I will have, when the exchange rate goes down, price of exports to fall. When the price of exports go down, the quantity of exports will rise, but because the good is inelastic, will rise by much less, and then we will have a case of export expenditure to actually end up, or export revenue to actually end up falling. So if the good is inelastic, we should not lower the price if we want to increase revenue. But what this Marshall Lender condition says this, that it's okay for it to be inelastic as long as the sum of both PED of x and PED of m is greater than 1, and there's a mathematical sort of proof for that. But as long as the sum is greater than 1, the sum is in this case 1.2, which is greater than 1, which means as long as the sum is greater than 1, you could lower your PED and you could see your x minus m to go up. So what this condition therefore says, that as long as PED of x plus m is greater than 1, the devaluation will work. Otherwise, we should not devalue. What if the sum is equal to 1? Well, if the sum is equal to 1, then devaluation will not change x minus m at all. And if the sum is less than 1, then devaluation will actually decrease our net exports. Also, one more thing which we need to understand is that as the larger the sum of PED of x and m, the smaller the amount of devaluation needed to get the required change in the net exports. So what do we mean by this? Basically, it also says this, that as long as the sum is first of all greater than 1, devaluation will work. But what if the sum is a lot more than 1? What if the goods are very elastic? Let's say goods are like, for example, what if my PED of sort of x is like 5 and PED of sort of m is like, for example, another 5. So the sum is going to be not more than 1, but actually much more than 1. Well, this means that you need to have very small devaluation in order to have your required change in net exports. But first thing first is this, that as long as the sum is more than 1, devaluation will work. Lastly, what we want to talk about is the J-curve effect. The J-curve effect simply says this, that if you want the devaluation to work, you need to remember that the balance of payment or the current account of the balance of payment will actually worsen before it starts to recover to a higher level. What do we mean by this? Well, basically, we mean to say is this, that the devaluation will work not in the short term but in the long run. So devaluation is basically going to only work in the long run. I want to show you the diagram for this. First of all, on my y-axis, I'm going to make my current account balance, or x minus m balance. Let me write this, x minus m balance, and I will have on my x-axis I have time, okay, and this is 0, which means this is my x minus m balance, which is negative. So because like this is when I am in a deficit, this is when I am in a surplus. And let's say a country right now is in a deficit, so a country is at point A. Now if they devalue the currency right now, what will happen? Well, we say this, if you devalue your currency, then what happens is basically in the short run, devaluation will actually backfire, because you will move probably from A to point B, which means your current account balance may actually end up worsening. And this time means that right now I'm in the short run, but as the time goes up, as we go in the long run, the x minus m balance will go up. So what it says is something like this. We make a J curve, something like this, where current account balance initially worsen in the short run, but then it starts to improve and may actually go up, may actually improve and may actually go up like this. So in the long run, you might be at point C. So devaluation, according to J-curve effect, will only work in the long run. It gets worse before it gets better. And the reason why it gets worse before it gets better is A, both exports and imports are inelastic in the short run, where devaluation will result in the current account to worsen. So what we say is this, that because exports and imports are inelastic in the short run, why? Because it takes time for people to sort of react to change their consumption pattern and react to change in prices. Because of that, because of consumers to slowly react to sort of price changes, what we say is that exports and imports are inelastic in the short run, and therefore if they are inelastic in the short run, we know this, when the price goes down, the quantity will go up by very little, and that end up causing export expenditure to actually worsen. So because both imports and exports are inelastic in the short run, devaluation will not work in the short run. In the long run, when the exports and imports become more elastic, devaluation will work and your expenditure balance will go up, and you will end up having your current account go from a deficit to a surplus. Not in the short run, but in the long run. And the second reason we give, which is where what we call devaluation doesn't work in the short run, is because many countries need to import raw materials and inputs such as oil to produce their exports. Like Pakistan, when they devalue the currency, they don't find it as a good news, because oil, which is a key input, becomes expensive. So with the foreign exchange rate, now they must pay more for these items, and which means that in the long run, countries will try to find cheaper inputs when they do so. In the long run, the X minus M balance will improve. So till the time they are unable to find the cheaper substitutes, which is basically in the short run, the X minus M will actually worsen. So just to repeat now the conditions which are necessary for devaluation to work, we say number one, there should not be any retaliation from other countries in terms of counter devaluation and trade barriers. Number two, there should be the Marshall-Lerner condition must be 2, which means the sum of elasticity of exports and imports must be greater than 1. And number three, the J-curve effect, which means that the current account balance will only improve in the long run and not in the short run. In the short run, things will actually worsen before they start to improve.